In the long northern winters that shaped Viking life more profoundly than any battle or voyage, the world slowed into a deep, cold stillness that wrapped itself around every settlement, and the people who had spent the warmer months raiding, trading, farming, and sailing now turned inward, drawing close to hearths that became the true center of existence, for winter in the Viking world was not simply a season but a test, a vast white presence that demanded preparation, endurance, and a certain quiet understanding of nature's power. Snow piled high against the wooden walls of longhouses, softening their shapes until they looked like half-buried beasts sleeping beneath furs of frost, and the smoke rising from their roofs curled into the dark northern sky like a steady promise that warmth still lived somewhere beneath the ice. Inside, families gathered beneath thick beams, surrounded by the smell of pine resin, cooked meat, and wool drying near the fire, and the longhouse filled with a low murmur of activity. Carving tools scraping quietly, women spinning wool with rhythmic patience, children whispering sagas they barely understood, and the fire crackling in a slow, steady language of its own. Outside the walls, the world belonged entirely to winter. Fjords froze at their edges, forests stood silent under heavy snow, and the daylight slipped away so early that dusk felt like a familiar visitor rather than an interruption. The Vikings knew this season well, knew that ships were useless on icy seas and that journeys across the mountains could become fatal traps, so the energy that once fed into exploration now funneled into craftsmanship, preparation, and storytelling. Warriors spent the dark afternoons repairing shields, sharpening blades dulled by salt and battle, or crafting new spear shafts from wood cured during the summer. Women stitched patterned garments meant to protect against the bitter winds, weaving runic symbols into cloaks for strength and good fortune. Even the animals huddled in stables kept close to the longhouse, their breath rising in soft clouds as they pressed together for warmth, reminding everyone that survival was a shared effort. Yet the Vikings did not view winter solely as hardship. To them it was also a sacred time, a season where the veil between worlds felt thinner, where gods and spirits moved more freely through the dark. Around the hearth, sagas rose like smoke, spinning tales of Odin wandering the storm winds, of Thor battling frost giants whose strength grew with the snow, and of ancestors who watched over the household from the edge of the firelight. These stories softened the night, turning fear into wonder, hardship into tradition, and darkness into a kind of vast, echoing hall where imagination settled comfortably beside reality. Feasting became a cherished break in the monotony, though even feasts were modest in the deepest winter months, made from stored grains, dried fish, smoked meat, and mead brewed in the autumn. The glow of torchlight reflected in drinking horns, laughter warmed the cold beams, and songs rose into the rafters, shaking loose little showers of frost. The most important celebration came during Jol, the winter festival that later inspired Yule and Christmas traditions, when families honored the gods, remembered their ancestors, and asked for luck and protection until the spring sun returned. On those nights the longhouse felt alive, the fire bright and urgent, the shadows dancing as though the spirits themselves joined the gathering. But even with moments of celebration, the Viking winter was long enough that time began to stretch, slow, and blur. The repetition of chores, the muffled world outside, the endless darkness all blended together into a dreamlike rhythm, one broken only by the soft crunch of a hunter returning through the snow or the sudden groan of a shifting ice sheet in the fjord. People learned to listen closely, to the wind, to the animals, to the creak of the roof beams, because winter spoke in subtle warnings and quiet gifts. A change in the snow's texture might signal a storm. A sudden warmth in the wind might mean melting ice and dangerous paths. A fox sighted near the settlement could hint at nearby prey or at some omen whispered by the gods. And as the months wore on, the first faint hints of returning sunlight felt like revelations. A slightly longer day, a patch of dripping ice, the distant call of birds returning to the coastline. Each small sign stirred the longhouse from its winter rhythm. Tools were checked, boats inspected, plans whispered for spring journeys and summer raids. Yet even as they prepared to return to the sea, the Vikings understood that winter had shaped them again, had tempered their resolve, sharpened their patience, and deepened their connection to the land and the unseen forces that guided their world. Thus, Viking winter was not merely endured. It was lived layer by layer through firelight, ritual, quiet labor, and the stories that bound past and present together beneath the vast northern dark. And as the winter nights lingered, stretching across the northern horizon like a great endless curtain of shadow, the Vikings settled deeper into a rhythm that only those born to harsh climates could truly understand, for the world outside seemed frozen in time, its silence broken only by the groan of shifting ice or the faint call of an animal braving the cold, and the longhouse became a world unto itself, a haven of warmth, noise, and flickering light suspended in a landscape swallowed by no. The air inside was thick with smoke from the hearth, mingling with the smell of cured meat, pine tar and damp wool, and though the space was crowded, men, women, children, visitors, even animals sharing the same roof, there was a comforting familiarity in that closeness, a sense that the walls themselves remembered every winter that had come before and would stand steady through this one as well. In these long dark months, time softened into a slow, steady pulse. Dawn arrived like a shy guest, staying only briefly before retreating behind another curtain of night, and tasks were guided more by the rhythm of the fire than by the sun. Vikings carved runes into bits of bone, shaping charms meant to bring protection through the coldest nights. Women tended the loom for hours at a time, the quiet tap of the shuttle echoing softly between the beams. Older warriors told stories of distant voyages beneath warmer skies, letting memories of faraway seas warm their imaginations when the fire grew low. Even simple chores, breaking ice from the water trough, checking the roof for snow buildup, repairing fishing nets by hand, became small acts of survival threaded throughout the endless nights. But winter also brought introspection, something the Vikings rarely admitted aloud. The darkness made the mind wander. Outside the longhouse, a single figure could feel swallowed by the vastness of the north, the sky so heavy with stars that it seemed to press down upon the earth. On clear nights, the aurora shimmered across the heavens in rippling curtains of green and violet, and the Vikings believed these lights were the reflections of Valkyries riding across the sky, choosing the fallen for Odin's hall. Children watched in awe. Adults watched with respect, reminded of how close the worlds of gods and mortals felt in these hours of cold and silence. And then there were the sounds, those small, uncanny murmurs that winter awakened. The distant crack of a frozen tree could sound like a giant's footfall. The whistle of wind through the rafters might resemble whispered voices. The shifting of snow on the roof sometimes made families glance upward as though expecting a visitor. The Vikings were practical people, yet they lived in a world where myth felt only an arm's reach away, and winter blurred the boundaries enough that even skeptics listened more carefully to the old stories when the storms howled through the fjord. As the season wore on, food stores became a quiet worry lingering at the edge of thought. The smoked fish and salted meat racks grew lighter, the grain slowly diminished, and hunters took cautious trips into the woods, following tracks through snow so deep it swallowed their boots. Each successful hunt was a relief, greeted with gratitude and silent prayer. Each failure tightened the atmosphere of the longhouse, though outwardly everyone continued their routines with the same steady resolve. Vikings did not voice fear. They simply endured. Yet winter was not only hardship, it was also the cradle of creativity. When storms raged outside and even the bravest would not open the door, songs filled the hall. Voices blended in melodies shaped by centuries of oral tradition, the kind of deep, resonant tunes that felt carved from the mountains themselves. Skalds, the keepers of stories, recited long sagas of ancient heroes and voyages across seas painted silver by moonlight. Their words wove warmth through the room, wrapping listeners in worlds far removed from the cold pressing against the door. And so, in these layers of labor, story, silence, and firelight, the Vikings waited. They waited for the sun to return, for the ice to loosen its grip on the sea, for the days when oars would once again bite into living water instead of frozen air. But they also understood that winter shaped them uniquely. It built patience, sharpened their instincts, and forged the quiet strength that defined their spirit. When the first true thaw finally came, when water began dripping from the eaves, when the air carried a faint hint of earth instead of snow, when the ravens returned to their restless circling above the settlement, it felt almost like waking from a long-shared dream. The people stepped blinking into the pale sunlight, feeling the strange lightness of a world no longer weighed down by darkness. Boats were prepared, fields assessed, journeys whispered about, but the memory of winter stayed with them, a cold imprint carved into their bones. For in Viking lands, winter was not merely endured. It was lived fully, fiercely, and with a deep, unspoken understanding that those who could thrive in the great northern dark could thrive anywhere the world carried them. And even as the first hints of spring teased the edges of the fjords, winter still held its long, lingering breath over the land, for in Viking territories the snow rarely surrendered all at once. It melted in slow, reluctant stages, leaving behind patches of ice that clung to the earth like memories unwilling to fade, and the people, trained by generations of patience, moved through these final weeks of cold with the same quiet resilience that had carried them through the darkest nights. Inside the longhouse, the fire burned lower now, not because winter had softened, but because wood stores had dwindled, each log a precious remainder of the season's long endurance. Families rationed their fuel carefully, letting the fire dim to embers during the day, feeding it only enough at night to keep the chill from settling too deeply into the beams and bones of the house. The atmosphere within was different now, still steeped in winter, but stirring gently with anticipation. Tools once stored away for the cold season were brought out again, sharpened, inspected, prepared for the returning demands of warmer weather. Men tightened the bindings of their shields, checking for cracks formed by the dryness of winter air, while women examined fishing nets, their fingers working swiftly and instinctively to mend the frayed knots. Even children felt the shift, sensing that their long months of indoor play, carved toys, and whispered stories were nearing an end. Soon they would run outside again, their boots sinking into soft earth instead of snow. Yet winter had one final role to play in the Viking world: reflection. The quiet that had blanketed the longhouse for months made way for more thoughtful conversations now, as elders gathered near the hearth to speak of seasons past, of journeys they had once taken across frozen seas, of comrades lost to storms or sickness, and of the lessons that winters teach more clearly than any other force. They spoke in calm, measured tones, voices softened by memory and respect. These were not stories meant to frighten nor to boast, but to remind the younger generations that the strength of a Viking was not in the swing of an axe or the pull of an oar, but in the ability to endure, to sit through long darkness, to share scarce food, to survive not through battle but through unity. Outside, the world gave small promises of change. A thin trickle of water beneath the ice hinted at the river awakening. Birds arrived hesitantly at the edges of the settlement, hopping across snow that still glittered under the pale sun. Hunters returning from the forest brought tidings of thawing trails and animal tracks newly printed in the softened snow. And every so often, a gentle breeze carried the scent of something distant and unfamiliar after months of frozen air, a faint whisper of moss or damp soil, or pine needles warming under sunlight. These small details were enough to stir hope without rushing the season. After all, the Vikings knew well that spring in the north was a cautious visitor, one easily frightened back into hiding by a single night of frost. But the people prepared nonetheless. Boats were inspected at the shoreline, their hulls revealed slowly as workers chipped away the ice binding them to land. The wooden frames creaked as though relieved to feel the open air again, and men ran their hands over the curves of the ships, thinking of distant coasts, of markets waiting beyond the sea, of raids, of trade, of the restless summer journeys that defined their identity just as winter defined their endurance. And yet, in these quiet moments, many of them felt a subtle gratitude for the winter's slow passing, for the way the cold months forced them into closeness, strengthened their bonds, and reminded them of the value of each resource shared beneath a thick roof of timber. As the sun climbed a fraction higher each day, families ventured outside more frequently, squinting at the brightness bouncing off the melting snow. They walked past the boundaries of the longhouse, past the animal pens, past the half-buried tools left from autumn, and looked upon the land with a renewed sense of purpose. The world seemed familiar yet strangely new, as though winter had erased and rewritten it at the same time. And when the first patches of bare earth appeared, dark, wet, and glistening, they stood in silence for a moment, acknowledging this small victory over the long, relentless cold. In the end, the Viking winter did not leave suddenly. It softened, faded, and released its grip inch by inch, allowing the people who had endured it to rise again with quiet dignity. For the Vikings understood that winter was not an enemy but a teacher, one that asked much of them, shaped their character, demanded their patience, and rewarded their endurance with a deeper appreciation for the seasons that followed. And when the fjords finally opened and the ships at last touched moving water, the Vikings stepped aboard not as people escaping a hardship, but as those who had been tempered by it, strengthened by the silence, the darkness, the cold, and the stories that had carried them through. Winter, in its grand northern vastness, remained behind them like a shadow, one they would face again year after year, with the same unshaken resolve that defined their way of life. And still winter lingered in the corners of the land, clinging to shaded hillsides and the deep folds of the forest where the sun's touch arrived last, as if the season itself wished to watch the Vikings take their first full steps back into the rhythms of the living world. Even when meltwater trickled freely through the village paths, pooling in frozen ruts that softened into muddy channels, the breath of winter hovered in the air, sharp at dawn, brittle at twilight, reminding everyone that the season was never truly gone, only resting, only waiting for its next turn to descend upon the north. Within the longhouse, the atmosphere grew brighter, though the fire still burned out of habit, more for comfort now than for survival. The smoke drifting upward carried the scent of optimism. People spoke more openly, laughed more easily, and moved with the restless impatience of those who had been indoors too long. Yet beneath the warmth, there remained a quiet reverence for the winter they had just endured. Every Viking, whether young or old, understood that the season had shaped their spirit just as surely as the sea shaped their sails. It had slowed their breath, deepened their thoughts, and reminded them that strength was not only measured in bold raids or distant voyages, but also in the silent endurance of long, unbroken nights. The elders sensed this shift before anyone else. They watched the younger ones with knowing eyes as they tested the thawed earth with tentative steps, as if relearning the feel of soil beneath their boots. They listened to the first songs of returning birds, thin, hesitant melodies that wove through the crisp morning air, and nodded in quiet approval. For them, the end of winter was not a sudden moment but a transition, a soft turning like pages in a saga that never truly ends. They had lived enough seasons to understand that each winter left a new mark on the soul, a deeper respect for the fragile balance between life and the forces that could so easily overwhelm it. Outside, the land changed visibly each day. Snow retreated down the slopes, revealing dark patches of earth mottled with frost and pine needles. The fjord loosened, its ice cracking gently like old wood stretching after a long sleep. Sometimes the sound echoed across the water and through the village, making people glance up instinctively, as though answering some ancient call. Hunters returned with news of tracks, elk, fox, even bear, printed fresh onto the softened ground. The animals, too, were awakening, emerging from the stark trials of winter with lean bodies and sharp instincts. Their presence signaled the renewal of an unspoken pact. Life would continue its cycle, and the Vikings would once again take their place within it. The longhouses themselves seemed to breathe differently. The walls, swollen from the damp cold, began to dry and settle. The thatched roofs dripped steadily, each droplet marking the slow erosion of winter's hold. Children stood beneath the eaves to catch the water on their tongues, laughing at the strange thrill of tasting the world as it thawed. Inside, women shook out furs and blankets, hanging them where the sun could finally reach. Men tested the fields, breaking the crust of earth with their boots, gauging whether the soil might soon be ready for planting. These small acts carried hope as powerfully as any feast or ritual. And though the ships remained moored in ice-fringed shallows, preparations for their awakening intensified. Oars were inspected, ropes rewound, sails checked for damage inflicted by months of storage. Men knelt beside the hulls, running their hands along the wood as if greeting an old friend, their fingers tracing the scars of past journeys. The smell of tar and resin filled the air again, a scent that hinted at distant horizons, at foreign markets and stormy seas, at the restless heartbeat of the Viking way of life. Even those who would not sail felt the excitement stirring like a pulse beneath the village. But perhaps the most important change was the return of long, unbroken silence being replaced by murmur, life's quiet music returning to the settlement. The clatter of tools outside the longhouse, the splash of animals wading into thawed water troughs, the low hum of voices planning, preparing, dreaming. These sounds meant that winter's story was nearly complete, its final chapter written through endurance rather than triumph. And yet, as the Vikings looked toward the coming seasons with anticipation, they carried winter with them, not as a burden, but as a kind of armor, a memory of cold resilience etched into their bones. They knew that the sea would soon call them outward, that the fields would soon summon them to labor, that the world would expand once again beyond the flickering walls of the longhouse. But they also knew that the quiet strength forged in the heart of winter would travel with them, guiding their hands, sharpening their instincts, steadying their souls. For a Viking did not simply survive winter. They emerged from it transformed, shaped by the darkness they had endured and prepared, once more, to meet whatever the world might bring when the sun finally rose high over the northern horizon. And as the thaw deepened, the land shifting from white stillness into a patchwork of shadowed snow and awakening earth, the Vikings began stepping fully back into a world they had watched only through cracks in the longhouse walls all winter long. With each passing day the air tasted different, lighter, easier to breathe, carrying a faint scent of wet bark and pine sap as trees shed their icy shells. It was a world stirring from a long sleep, and the Vikings moved through it with the same mixture of reverence and readiness that had carried them through the cold months, their boots sinking into softened ground that squelched underfoot, their breath no longer crystallizing in the air. But winter did not leave quietly. It lingered like a ghost at the edges of vision. A late snow would fall unexpectedly, dusting the roofs in a thin pale layer. A sudden frost at dawn would turn puddles to glass, surprising even the elders who had seen countless seasons. The Vikings took these moments not as threats but as reminders, nodding to themselves as though winter were giving them one last lesson. Do not forget me. Do not take the warmth for granted. And they didn't. Every action they took in these transitional days carried a hint of caution, a quiet acknowledgement that nature moved at its own pace. Inside the longhouses, the fire crackled more softly now, burning smaller logs, burning more for comfort than survival. People opened shutters during the day, letting strips of sunlight carve bright pathways across dirt floors that had known only firelight for months. Children played in these warm stripes, tracing shapes with their fingers, fascinated by the simple joy of sunlight touching their skin. Even the animals perked up, stepping outside with tentative curiosity, snorting steam into the warming air as they rediscovered familiar scents buried beneath winter's weight. The community itself began to expand outward. Paths that had remained dangerous or impassable in winter now softened into muddy trails. Men walked down to the shoreline more often, sometimes just to stand and listen to the shifting ice, imagining the moment when the fjord would finally break open and the sea would call them back. Women inspected storage buildings, taking careful stock of supplies that had survived the winter and laying plans for what needed to be replenished, traded or prepared. Young people ran errands again, carrying messages or gathering firewood, grateful to feel their legs stretch in ways impossible during the dark months. And still the sagas continued. Winter had not extinguished them. If anything, it had distilled them. The skalds, those keepers of memory and myth, ventured outside once more, telling stories beneath open skies that had hidden behind storm clouds for so long. Their voices carried across the settlement more clearly now, unmuted by snow or wind. They spoke of gods who guided the seasons, of ancestors who endured greater storms, of journeys yet to come. And as villagers paused in their tasks to listen, the sagas felt different, freer, more hopeful, touched by the promise of renewal. One evening, as the sky glowed with a deeper shade of gold than anyone had seen since autumn, a murmur spread through the settlement. The ice was shifting in the fjord. People walked to the shoreline in small groups, watching as cracks widened across the frozen surface, the water beneath pushing upward, testing its strength. The sound of ice breaking was like thunder muffled beneath a blanket, rolling through the air with a strange, echoing rhythm. For the Vikings, this was more than a natural event. It was a signal, a reminder that their world was opening again. Soon the boats would move. Soon the sea would resume its role as both challenge and companion. But before any journey began, there was reflection. Winter had a way of slowing the heart, sharpening the senses, forcing people to confront themselves in the silence. Now, at winter's end, the Vikings carried those quiet lessons with them. They understood that strength was not only in their weapons or their ships but in their ability to become still, to wait, to endure long nights without losing hope. And as they looked out over the cracking ice, they felt not only excitement but gratitude. For the fire that had kept them warm, for the stories that had kept them connected, for the community that had carried them through the cold. In time, the last sheets of ice drifted away, carried by currents toward the open sea. The fjords shimmered again with living water. The longhouses seemed brighter, lighter, as though winter's weight had finally lifted from their beams. And the people began preparing with renewed energy, patching sails, mending lines, stacking supplies, each task building toward the moment when the first ship would finally push away from the shore. But even as they looked forward to these journeys, every Viking knew that the memory of winter would follow them. It lived in the calm of their breath, in the steadiness of their hands, in the quiet confidence forged under months of darkness. For winter had shaped them, tempered them, and taught them that resilience was not loud or brash but quiet, steady and patient. And so they stepped into spring not as those who had merely survived, but as those who had been remade by the cold, ready once more to meet the vast, unpredictable world beyond their fjords, with winter's wisdom resting solidly in their bones. And as the thaw deepened, the land shifting from white stillness into a patchwork of shadowed snow and awakening earth, the Vikings began stepping fully back into a world they had watched only through cracks in the longhouse walls all winter long. With each passing day the air tasted different, lighter, easier to breathe, carrying a faint scent of wet bark and pine sap as trees shed their icy shells. It was a world stirring from a long sleep, and the Vikings moved through it with the same mixture of reverence and readiness that had carried them through the cold months, their boots sinking into softened ground that squelched underfoot, their breath no longer crystallizing in the air. But winter did not leave quietly. It lingered like a ghost at the edges of vision. A late snow would fall unexpectedly, dusting the roofs in a thin, pale layer. A sudden frost at dawn would turn puddles to glass, surprising even the elders who had seen countless seasons. The Vikings took these moments not as threats but as reminders, nodding to themselves as though winter were giving them one last lesson. Do not forget me. Do not take the warmth for granted. And they didn't. Every action they took in these transitional days carried a hint of caution, a quiet acknowledgement that nature moved at its own pace. Inside the longhouses, the fire crackled more softly now, burning smaller logs, burning more for comfort than survival. People opened shutters during the day, letting strips of sunlight carve bright pathways across dirt floors that had known only firelight for months. Children played in these warm stripes, tracing shapes with their fingers, fascinated by the simple joy of sunlight touching their skin. Even the animals perked up, stepping outside with tentative curiosity, snorting steam into the warming air as they rediscovered familiar scents buried beneath winter's weight. The community itself began to expand outward. Paths that had remained dangerous or impassable in winter now softened into muddy trails. Men walked down to the shoreline more often, sometimes just to stand and listen to the shifting ice, imagining the moment when the fjord would finally break open and the sea would call them back. Women inspected storage buildings, taking careful stock of supplies that had survived the winter and laying plans for what needed to be replenished, traded or prepared. Young people ran errands again, carrying messages or gathering firewood, grateful to feel their legs stretch in ways impossible during the dark months. And still the sagas continued. Winter had not extinguished them. If anything, it had distilled them. The skalds, those keepers of memory and myth, ventured outside once more, telling stories beneath open skies that had hidden behind storm clouds for so long. Their voices carried across the settlement more clearly now, unmuted by snow or wind. They spoke of gods who guided the seasons, of ancestors who endured greater storms, of journeys yet to come. And as villagers paused in their tasks to listen, the sagas felt different, freer, more hopeful, touched by the promise of renewal. One evening, as the sky glowed with a deeper shade of gold than anyone had seen since autumn, a murmur spread through the settlement. The ice was shifting in the fjord. People walked to the shoreline in small groups, watching as cracks widened across the frozen surface, the water beneath pushing upward, testing its strength. The sound of ice breaking was like thunder muffled beneath a blanket, rolling through the air with a strange, echoing rhythm. For the Vikings, this was more than a natural event. It was a signal, a reminder that their world was opening again. Soon the boats would move. Soon the sea would resume its role as both challenge and companion. But before any journey began, there was reflection. Winter had a way of slowing the heart, sharpening the senses, forcing people to confront themselves in the silence. Now, at winter's end, the Vikings carried those quiet lessons with them. They understood that strength was not only in their weapons or their ships but in their ability to become still, to wait, to endure long nights without losing hope. And as they looked out over the cracking ice, they felt not only excitement but gratitude. For the fire that had kept them warm, for the stories that had kept them connected, for the community that had carried them through the cold. In time, the last sheets of ice drifted away, carried by currents toward the open sea. The fjord shimmered again with living water. The longhouses seemed brighter, lighter, as though winter's weight had finally lifted from their beams. And the people began preparing with renewed energy, patching sails, mending lines, stacking supplies, each task building toward the moment when the first ship would finally push away from the shore. But even as they looked forward to these journeys, every Viking knew that the memory of winter would follow them. It lived in the calm of their breath, in the steadiness of their hands, in the quiet confidence forged under months of darkness. For winter had shaped them, tempered them, and taught them that resilience was not loud or brash but quiet, steady, and patient. And so they stepped into spring not as those who had merely survived, but as those who had been remade by the cold, ready once more to meet the vast, unpredictable world beyond their fjords, with winter's wisdom resting solidly in their bones. And even as the sun climbed higher each day, brushing the edges of the mountains with warmer gold, the memory of winter remained woven through the settlement like a faint, lingering echo. The Vikings carried it with them in the way they moved. Steadier now, but always alert, always listening for the subtle shifts in the world around them. Winter had sharpened their instincts. It had stripped life down to its essentials and rebuilt it through firelight, patience, and shared endurance. Now, as the cold loosened its grip, spring invited them to step forward again, but not without the lessons etched into their bones. The fields, once hidden beneath an unbroken sheet of snow, emerged in slow stages. First the tops of stones showed through the melting crust, then the brittle stalks of last year's growth, and finally the dark soil itself, rich, damp, and waiting. Farmers knelt to touch the earth, letting it crumble between their fingers, testing its readiness not with words but with the quiet familiarity of people who had spent their entire lives listening to the land. The soil was softening. It was nearly time to begin the cycle again. Seeds, carefully stored through winter, would soon be brought out from their clay pots. Tools would bite into the ground once more. Life would return where only silence had lived for months. But before the first furrow was dug, there was always one final gathering, a moment when the community stepped back to acknowledge that they had come through the hardest part of the year. It was not a grand celebration, not like the feasts of high summer or the solemn rituals of Joel, but rather a quiet, collective breath. Elders shared warm broth with the youngest children. Hunters laid dried winter skins in a heap to be cured for spring trade, and women tied freshly spun wool into tight rolls, ready to be dyed once the plants for pigments began to bloom again. These small rituals bound the community together just as tightly as any oath. They were reminders that survival was not a solitary act but a shared rhythm, repeated generation after generation. Meanwhile, down by the water, the great ships rested like animals stretching slowly from hibernation. Their hulls, once locked in ice, now floated freely in the cold, dark water of the fjord. Men waded in up to their knees, ignoring the shock of the freezing tide, checking the joints where would met iron, tightening bindings, scraping away the grime gathered from months of stillness. The rhythmic tap of their hammers echoed across the shoreline, steady and purposeful, a sound that meant life was returning to motion. It was not long now before the sails, patched with care during winter, would unfurl to catch the first strong winds of the season. Children watched eagerly from the shore, wide-eyed. fascinated by the idea that these wooden giants would soon slip out toward far horizons. They mimicked the motions of rowing with sticks, pretending to move through imagined storms, laughing when the cold water splashed their boots. Their parents watched them with soft amusement, for they knew that some of these children would one day follow the same sea paths, shaped not only by courage but also by winters just like the one they had survived. Inside the longhouses, winter's shadows finally began to thin. Furs that once lined every sleeping space were shaken out and hung to dry. Storage rooms, once low and dim, were opened wide to reveal exactly how much food remained, what could be celebrated as surplus, and what would need to be replanned for the coming year. Women sang softly as they worked, the familiar melodies of spring rituals rising into the rafters, pushing out the heavy quiet that had claimed the home during the darkest months. And though the world around them shifted toward brightness, the Vikings did not forget the cold that had governed their lives. They remembered the deep nights when even the strongest warrior felt small beneath the weight of wind and snow. They remembered the creaking beams, the frost that crawled across the inside of windows, the silence so complete it felt like another presence in the room. They remembered how they had endured, not through force alone, but through wisdom, companionship, and the steady belief that the sun would return. Now, with its return fully underway, they felt not just relief, but gratitude. Life was no longer suspended. It was unfolding once more in long, slow, widening circles. There were journeys to plan, fields to tend, sails to hoist, stories to carry forward. And though the season ahead held its own trials, storms, toil, the uncertainty of voyages, they would meet them with the same quiet resilience winter had taught them. For in the Viking world, winter was not merely something to survive. It was a teacher, a sculptor, a silent companion that shaped the heart as surely as the sea shaped the shore. And now, standing at the threshold of spring, the Vikings stepped into the light with a strength forged in darkness, ready once again to live fully in a world that had finally awakened from its long, icy dream. And as the warmth continued its slow ascent into the northern world, the Viking settlement shifted into a new rhythm, one that felt both familiar and startling after so many months of restraint. The thawed earth welcomed footsteps again, soft under boots but no longer treacherous, no longer threatening to swallow travelers in drifts of snow or disguise hidden ice beneath the surface. The air no longer carried the sharp bite of winter, but instead a cool gentleness, touched with a faint scent of budding pine and damp soil. It was spring, not fully grown but unmistakably present, and to the Vikings it felt like stepping from one world into another. The longhouses, once sealed tight against howling winds, stood open during the day. Shutters creaked as they were pushed wide, letting in sunlight that cut warm angles across the floors. Dust motes danced in those beams like tiny sparks of gold, lifting spirits in ways that no feast or ritual ever could. People worked with their sleeves rolled up, grateful for the simple ease of movement that the cold had taken from them. Children ran in and out, chasing one another across newly exposed grass, their laughter drifting into the sky that had finally shed its winter weight. Still, even as life quickened, winter reminded them of its lasting effects. Stores were low. Tools were worn. Cloaks were threadbare in spots where the cold had gnawed too deeply. But none of this brought fear. Only determination. These were challenges the Vikings understood well. They mended what could be mended, replaced what could not, and approached the tasks of spring with the focused energy of people who had endured months of darkness and were ready, now, to rebuild their world piece by piece. In the evenings, when the settlement settled into quiet conversation, people gathered outside instead of around the hearth. They sat on logs and stones still cold from winter, warming their hands around bowls of stew as they watched the sky deepen into shades of pale violet and deep blue. The stars returned softly, without the harsh brilliance they held in the frozen months. The aurora, more distant now, flickered only faintly above the mountains. It was as though the world itself was calming, offering a peaceful transition rather than an abrupt shift. The sea, though still frigid, had regained its movement. The fjord no longer lay trapped beneath ice, but rippled with gentle waves that lapped against the shore as if testing their freedom. Men stood on the docks, listening to the water as though it were speaking to them. In a sense it was The sea was telling them it was almost time. Time for journeys, for trade, for raids, for exploration. Time for the world beyond the settlement to open once more. But the Vikings did not rush. They waited until the winds shifted, until the tides aligned, until the cold no longer clung so fiercely to the edges of the boats. And as they prepared their ships, there was something ceremonial in their actions. They polished shields, not merely for battle but for the pride of starting a season anew. They tightened ropes with a respect bordering on reverence, for these ropes would hold against storms and tides. They spoke of distant lands, of the soft hills of the British Isles, the markets along the Baltic, the wild icy seas beyond Greenland that only the bravest dreamed of crossing. These conversations held no boastfulness, only an understanding that life was wide and unpredictable, and that each journey carried both risk and promise. Even those who stayed behind felt the shift. Women began preparing dyes for cloth, gathering the first herbs of spring to flavor meals, checking on livestock who were eager to graze again. Elders taught the younger ones how to read the changing signs in the land. When the birds' cries signaled storms, when the earth's warmth meant planting could begin, when the winds carried warnings from the north. Knowledge passed quietly like this, without ceremony, but each word held the weight of generations. And in the final evenings before the first ships of the season would slip from the fjord into open water, the community gathered for one more quiet, reflective moment. They stood along the shoreline together, watching the sun sink into the horizon, its light shimmering across the newly freed water. No speeches were given. No rituals performed. The silence alone was enough, a shared acknowledgement that winter had ended, that they had endured, that the world was ready for motion again. For the Vikings knew something that only those who lived so close to the edge of survival could fully understand. Every spring was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the close of winter's grip, but also the start of journeys not yet written. Journeys across seas, across mountains, across seasons still waiting to unfold. And as they watched the last sliver of sunlight disappear, each person felt, deep within their bones, the quiet strength winter had given them. A strength that would carry them through whatever came next. A strength forged in darkness, awakened in light, and carried forward like a flame passed from one season to the next, never extinguished, only transformed. And so the final days before the great departure carried a quiet electricity, a feeling that something vast and ancient was stirring beneath the surface of everyday tasks. The Vikings moved through their routines with a purpose sharpened by months of stillness, as though the entire settlement, every longhouse, every boat, every person, was inhaling in unison, preparing for a long-awaited exhale. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The way people spoke in slightly quicker tones, the way even the elders rose earlier, the way the warriors tested their footing on the docks as if measuring the pull of the world beyond the fjord. The morning air carried hints of salt and thawed earth, and although the wind still held the last remnants of winter's bite, it no longer felt hostile, only cool, invigorating, full of promise. Men carried crates of supplies down to the ships. Dried fish, mead, preserved berries, bundles of wool and furs to trade. Their boots thumped on the wooden planks in a steady rhythm that mingled with the cawing of the ravens circling overhead. The birds seemed to sense the shift as well, drifting low enough to eye the cargo, their black wings flashing blue in the rising sun. Women gathered near the shoreline, handing off final bundles, offering quiet blessings, their voices low and steady as they pressed tokens of protection. Small carved runes, knots of dyed thread, into the hands of those preparing to sail. These gestures were not dramatic or ceremonial. They were woven into life itself, as seamless as breathing. Even the youngest children understood what they meant. Protection, memory, and a thread connecting the one who left to the one who remained. Inside the longhouses, the atmosphere was strangely warm, almost tender. The great hearths burned bright in the early hours, but not out of necessity. Rather, it was tradition. Fires lit on departure days were meant to burn clean and strong, carrying the hopes of the household into the world beyond. Elders tended them with care, stirring the embers, feeding them measured logs, watching the flames rise with soft, contemplative eyes. They had seen this cycle many times. Departure, return, departure again. and understood that these moments, quiet as they seemed, were thresholds between two worlds. When the sun reached its morning height, the time had come. The settlement gathered along the fjord, the water shining like hammered steel beneath the sky. The ships, their hulls dark and sleek from fresh layers of tar, bobbed gently in the tide. Warriors and sailors boarded with practiced ease, their movements steady and sure, their expressions a mixture of determination and inward focus. No one expected certainty on the sea. They expected challenge, possibility, and the unknown, and they stepped toward it willingly. The first ship pushed away from the dock with a low, groaning creak, its oars dipping into the water in perfect coordination. The second followed, then the third. The sound of rowing echoed off the mountains, slow at first, then growing more synchronized as the ships found their rhythm. The fjord embraced them, opening gently as though parting just for this moment. Those left on the shore watched in silence, not with sorrow, but with a solemn pride that ran deeper than words. They knew the world awaited those ships. They knew the return was not guaranteed. They knew this was the way of things. As the ships reached the wider mouth of the fjord, the wind finally caught their waiting sails. The fabric swelled, snapping in the breeze like the wings of some great bird ready to take flight. The vessels surged forward, no longer relying on oars alone, and for a moment the entire settlement seemed to hold its breath, watching as the fleet transformed from wooden outlines into distant silhouettes against the horizon. Only when the ships were nearly out of sight did the villagers begin to drift back toward their daily tasks. The rhythm of life would continue, fields to tend, animals to care for, tools to repair, meals to prepare. Yet beneath it all lay the pulse of something shared, the understanding that the world had opened once again, that winter had released its grip, that possibility waited across the sea. And for those who sailed, the memory of winter remained a quiet companion. They carried it in the steadiness of their hands on the oars, in the calm with which they faced the unpredictable winds, in the unspoken bond forged in darkness and firelight. Winter had tempered them, spring had released them, and now the sea would shape them once more. As the fjord returned to its gentle, steady tide, the settlement settled into a new season, one defined not by surviving the cold, but by embracing the world beyond their shores. Yet every Viking knew that no matter how far their journeys took them, the memory of winter, the stillness, the endurance, the resilience carved into their bones, would travel with them, steady as the North Star, guiding them through whatever storms lay ahead. And as the ships disappeared beyond the bend of the fjord, small dark shapes swallowed slowly by the brightening horizon, the village settled into the quiet hum of spring work, though the absence of the departing crew lingered like a soft hollow in the air. Life did not pause. Vikings never paused. But the rhythm shifted. Tasks once shared by many now fell to fewer hands, and every person felt both the added weight of responsibility and the quiet pride that came with carrying it. The women walked back from the shoreline in small groups, their steps steady, their voices low, speaking not of worry but of plans. What fields to prepare first, what supplies to stretch, how to manage the early planting before the full warmth arrived. Children followed behind, still half watching the sea even after the ships had vanished, their imaginations sailing alongside their fathers and brothers and cousins into unknown waters, weaving silent stories of storms and treasures and distant lands. They would carry those stories for months, repeating them as games, imitating the sound of oars with sticks, drawing shapes of ships in the damp earth. Inside the longhouses, the atmosphere had changed too. The space felt larger, quieter, as though the rooms themselves were waiting. The great hearths continued to burn, not for survival but for steadiness, a comforting reminder that warmth and life remained rooted here no matter how many left to seek fortune elsewhere. Women tended the fires with rhythmic motions, stirring pots, preparing meals too humble to be called feasts but still hearty enough to strengthen those who stayed behind. The scent of broth drifted through the hall, mingling with the lingering traces of pine smoke and wool, a familiar smell, grounding in its simplicity. Elders gathered in small clusters near the warmest corners, speaking softly, their weathered hands gesturing as they recalled their own voyages, their own departures, the many springs they had watched unfold like this one. Their memories were both warnings and comforts, stories shaped by time and softened by repetition. They remembered storms that had stolen ships but also journeys that had brought back riches beyond imagining. They remembered fierce battles and unexpected alliances. They remembered ice-crusted decks and sunlit foreign marketplaces. And as they spoke, the younger listeners absorbed every word, storing them away like seeds that would one day sprout into courage. Outside, the village pulsed with renewed purpose. Farmers broke the soil, their tools sinking into the earth with satisfying resistance. What had been frozen for months now yielded beneath their hands, releasing the earthy scent of life returning. They moved in wide arcs across the fields, their muscles conditioned by winter's stillness but eager to work again. Each furrow carved into the ground felt like a promise, a silent agreement between land and people that growth would come, that the year would bear fruit if tended with care. The animals, too, felt the seasons shift. Goats and sheep wandered farther from the shelters, noses to the ground as they searched for the first tender shoots pushing through thawed soil. Horses snorted and pawed at the earth, energized by the warmer air. Chickens clucked impatiently outside the longhouse doors, pecking at insects newly awakened by sunlight. Life blossomed again in small ways, humility and vitality intertwined. Meanwhile, by the water, repair work continued for the ships that remained. Not all vessels set out at once. Some stayed behind for shorter journeys, to nearby settlements, to fishing grounds, to lonely stretches of coast where seaweed, driftwood, and shellfish collected after long winter tides. The men repairing these vessels worked with easy cooperation, their movements unhurried yet efficient. They joked softly among themselves, but beneath the laughter there was a shared understanding that these smaller journeys mattered just as much as the grand ones. Every part of life in the north was connected. Every task fed into another. And in the quiet hours of evening, when the sky dimmed into soft shades of violet and the first stars appeared, the village gathered once more, but now on land instead of along the fjord. Families sat on low stools or stones warmed faintly by the day's sun. They spoke of practical things at first, the planting, the fishing, the repairs, but as the light shifted and the night deepened, their voices lowered into something softer, more reflective. It was in these moments that winter's memory returned, not with cold, not with fear, but with a strange kind of closeness. They remembered the long nights huddled by the hearth, the weight of snow pressing against the walls, the silence that had felt endless. But now that silence seemed like a distant dream, almost comforting in retrospect. It had shaped them quietly, giving them the patience to wait for spring, the strength to send ships into the unknown, the resilience to rebuild year after year. And as the fire pits crackled in the open air, their flames dancing in the darkening sky, the Vikings felt the season settling fully around them, not as a challenge now, but as a companion. Spring had come, steady and certain. Life was moving forward again. And though the sea held their loved ones far away, the land held those who remained, anchored firmly by the rituals, the work, and the enduring spirit forged through countless winters. In the soft glow of twilight, the village breathed as one, alive, steady, waiting for news, waiting for growth, waiting for the next chapter of a story that stretched far across oceans yet always began and ended here, in the quiet strength of a northern spring. ChatGPT. And as the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher still, the settlement eased into the full pulse of spring, a season not of sudden transformation, but of gradual awakening. Each Viking felt it differently. In the warmth creeping into their bones, in the loosening of stiff joints once tightened by months of cold, in the way sounds traveled differently now that the land was no longer muffled by snow. Even the wind had changed. It no longer carried winter's sharp warning, but a gentler tone, as if encouraging life to stretch, to rise, to begin again. The fields, once dormant beneath a frozen veil, now glistened with new shoots. Farmers moved among them with careful attention, adjusting soil, clearing the last debris left by winter, whispering small blessings as they planted seeds gathered through years of tradition. The earth responded eagerly, soaking up the moisture from spring rains and the warmth of lengthening days. Tiny green stems pushed upward, promises of food, trade, and survival. These emerging crops were more than plants. They were symbols of continuity, anchors in a world shaped by cycles of hardship and renewal. In the forests surrounding the village, life stirred in deeper, wilder ways. Streams that had vanished under ice now ran clear and fast, cutting through moss-covered stones with a sound like distant laughter. Birds returned in flocks, their calls echoing between trees still damp from melting snow. Hunters followed their trails, pausing whenever they spotted fresh prints in the softened earth. Elk, boar, even wolves moved cautiously through the woods again, thinner but alive, reclaiming their place in the season's rhythm. For the Vikings, these signs were reassuring. Nature itself had survived the winter's grip, just as they had. Meanwhile, in the heart of the settlement, tasks multiplied but never overwhelmed. Women gathered herbs now sprouting along the edges of longhouse walls, wild garlic, sorrel, young nettles, ingredients that brought fresh scents to kitchens that had grown accustomed to dried winter fare. The first pots of spring stew simmered over the hearth, their aroma drifting out into the open air, mingling with the clean scent of rain-soaked earth. Children, no longer confined to narrow indoor spaces, chased one another across open fields, splashed through puddles, and returned home muddy, breathless, and laughing. Their joy was a quiet mirror of the season's own relief. Yet beneath all this renewed life, the presence of the absent lingered gently. Those who had sailed away still occupied the thoughts of the village, present in every prayer, every story told beside the fire, every glance cast toward the open water. The sea was both a giver and a taker, and though the Vikings understood this balance deeply, they felt its weight each time the horizon stretched out empty and quiet. Still, they moved forward with the calm resilience that winter had carved into them. Worry was natural, but trust was essential. The sea would carry their loved ones where they needed to go, just as the land carried those who remained. From time to time, a lone scout would climb the ridge rising above the fjord, not to search anxiously, but simply to feel the world from a higher vantage. Up there, the air was cooler, the wind stronger, whispering through the grasses in a voice that spoke of distant storms and shifting tides. The scout would listen, narrowing their eyes toward the horizon, imagining sails reappearing one by one. These quiet vigils were a kind of ritual, a way to stay connected with those who had departed, as though watching the horizon could weave invisible threads between the land and the sea. And though the ships were gone, the settlement itself felt more alive than ever. New structures were repaired, some expanded. Pathways widened where ice had once made them narrow. People spoke of upcoming gatherings with neighboring villages, exchanges of tools, stories, and alliances forged over shared meals. Such gatherings were essential to Viking life, strengthening ties across distances made harsh by winter. Now, with spring fully unfolding, these connections would regrow like vines along old wooden beams. As the evenings arrived, soft and lingering, the village often gathered outside once more, but this time not in silence or solemnity. Instead, gentle conversation rose into the night air. Laughter returned. Instruments, simple harps, flutes carved from bone, drums stretched with animal hide, began to play again, carrying music into the twilight. Children danced barefoot in the grass. Elders smiled at the sound, knowing that music had been one of the season's last luxuries to disappear in winter, and now one of the first to return. And so, gradually, almost without noticing, the Vikings stepped fully into the season of life. Winter's lessons remained with them, etched deeply into their instincts, shaping their patience, sharpening their gratitude. But now the world opened its arms. It offered possibility. It offered movement. It offered the chance to dream beyond the harsh grip of the North. Yet even in this renewal, one truth held firm: the cycle would return. Winter would come again, as it always had. But when it did, these people, strengthened by spring, fortified by tradition, linked by community, would meet it not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of those who had endured countless seasons before. For now, though, they lived in spring's embrace, working, waiting, hoping, and listening to the distant whisper of the sea, knowing that one day, when the sails returned to the horizon, the story of winter, spring, and the endless turning of the world would begin anew. And as spring ripened slowly into its fuller form, the days stretching longer and the winds losing their final hints of winter's breath, the settlement settled into a tranquility that felt earned, soft, steady, and threaded with quiet expectation. The harsh roar of winter had faded completely now, replaced by gentler sounds. The creaking of drying timber, the buzzing of early insects skimming above puddles, the rhythmic thud of tools against soil, and the distant laughter of children rediscovering the world beyond snowbanks. The fields grew greener each day. Rows that had once been bare now shimmered with tender shoots rising confidently toward the sun. Farmers walked between them with measured steps, inspecting the growth with an almost parental pride. They spoke softly to one another, discussing rains, winds, and the promise of a stronger harvest than the year before. Every new sprout represented stability. Every healthy row meant food, trade, and the reassurance that their months of winter restraint had been worth the effort. Near the forest's edge, wildflowers began to appear. Small at first, then in clusters, their colors bright against the earth still dark from thaw. Women and older children gathered them in baskets, weaving garlands or saving certain blooms for dyes and medicines. These first flowers were treasured not only for their beauty but for their symbolism, proof that the earth, once again, had forgiven the long months of cold and begun to flourish. The animals sensed this shift too. Sheep grazed with renewed appetite, dotting the hillside like scattered clouds. Goats balanced on rocks warmed by the sun, testing their agility after months of cramped shelter. Horses galloped along the fjord trail, their hooves drumming a rhythm that echoed into the open air. Even the village dogs grew livelier, chasing shadows and running alongside children with playful barks. In winter, every living creature conserved strength. Now, each one seemed eager to expend it. Inside the longhouses, the air had changed as well. The heavy smell of smoke and stored winter goods was replaced with scents of damp wood, fresh herbs, and open breezes. Doors no longer stayed shut. They swung wide in the daylight, letting conversations drift between homes. Women cleaned the woven walls, shaking out furs and blankets, reorganizing storerooms with the satisfaction of knowing they had survived another season together. A sense of renewal spread through each household, not loud or proud, but deep and calm. Elders spent longer hours outdoors now, sitting on carved wooden stools and watching the village move with easy coordination. Their eyes followed the children weaving between houses, the workers shaping wood, the animals grazing near the fence lines. They remembered springs from decades ago, springs that had arrived late or early, harsh or generous. And though they rarely spoke these memories aloud unless asked, they carried them with quiet gratitude. Every new spring was a blessing, but every spring also held the memory of winters endured, of loved ones lost, of resilience passed down through generations. In the evenings, when the sky turned soft shades of rose and silver, families often gathered near the water. The fjord, no longer frozen, reflected the shifting colors like polished metal. Some evenings were calm, so calm that the surface appeared unmoving. Other evenings carried a breeze, sending ripples across the water that glimmered like firelight. People sat on smooth stones or old wooden logs, their faces turned toward the horizon where the ships had vanished weeks before. They wondered where their loved ones were now, what storms they faced, what distant lands they stepped upon, what stories they would eventually bring home. Sometimes the conversation grew spirited as parents told tales from their own youth, journeys across seas, encounters with strange foods or foreign customs. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining the world as a vast, mysterious expanse filled with cities of stone, forests of impossible size, and seas stretching farther than any mind could truly comprehend. These stories stitched imagination into memory, shaping dreams that would one day carry the next generation out onto the same unpredictable waters. But even as they spoke of faraway adventures, the villagers always returned to their work at dawn with quiet resolve. Spring was generous, but it demanded effort. Nets were repaired. Fish traps were set along the fjord's bends. New birch logs were cut, stripped, and stacked for the coming year's needs. Paths were cleared, fences mended, and old tools reforged at the smithy now that the forge could burn freely without winter's breath smothering the flames. And through it all, the subtle hum of waiting persisted, not impatient, not anxious, but steady, as constant as the tide. For beyond the horizon, the ships carried pieces of the settlement's heart. Sons and fathers, wives and sisters disguised as warriors, traders, dreamers, explorers. Their absence shaped every decision, every shared look, every quiet moment of thought. The settlement lived fully in spring, yet part of its spirit remained tethered to the sea. One night, as the sky stretched into a deep blue twilight, a soft breeze swept across the fjord, carrying with it the far-off scent of salt and something else, something that felt like a whisper. Those standing by the water paused, listening, though they could not name what they were listening for. Perhaps it was only the sound of waves against stone. Perhaps it was the echo of distant storms. Or perhaps, deep in their bones, they felt the earliest hint of returning sails. But whether the ships returned tomorrow, or in a week, or in a month, the village would greet them with the same steady strength that had carried them through every winter. Spring had opened the world again, but winter had shaped their souls. And so they waited, not with fear, not with urgency, but with the quiet, patient certainty of those who understood the rhythm of the world, and their enduring place within it.